Okay, you want to, who gets to start it off?
On behalf of ISID faculty and the director of ISID, warm welcome to Professor Kunal Sen, who is the director, UNU Wider. We had him last year as well, because in this hall only there was a book discussion of the recent book, Development Dilemma. And many of the renowned development economists were there in the panel. So today also we are going to have this seminar, and this seminar would be chaired by Professor T.C. Anand, who was a former professor of Delhi School of Economics and chief statistician of India, and currently visiting professor at ISID. So over to you, sir.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's really nice to be here. It was very nice to catch up with Kunal. I'm seeing him after a long time. Let me not take too much time right now, because we've gathered here to listen to Kunal, and we have a very rich group of discussants who will add to the discussion. And since I notice a lot of you have joined both physically and virtually, I look forward to a fairly enriching discussion. So maybe what I'll just lay down broad rules. Kunal said he'll take about 40 minutes for his presentation. Then the discussants will probably take about 10 minutes apiece. That will take us to about an hour and 20 minutes, which will still leave us some time for comments or questions from the floor. But let me emphasize that right away. I would request anybody asking a question or comment on the floor to keep it extremely short and make your point very crisply, because there are quite a few of you, and we'll finally give another time to sum up or make a final response if he has at the end. So let's get the floor is yours.
So
yeah, maybe you can just manage it with this.
Okay, so all right, I think it's like we are ready to go. So what I'm going to do is present maybe 30 less than after the 40 minutes or maybe 30 minutes. Because the idea in this case is not really a research seminar in the strict sense of the word, because it is very much early work, and also really we are start after 2 hours with other people, because of PC mentioned, we have a very good analyst also here, and so it's great to be here again in this room. So, and what I'm going to try and do is kind of tell you through some set of graphs, a story which you may or may not agree with, which is what the whole point of having a discussion is. So the story that I'm telling you is perhaps not something that is usually the usual narrative, the conventional narrative, I think, about India. But I strongly believe that what I'm going to present to you is what I think is what's going on in India, and I'll try and convince you why I think that way. So, the story, the good story, the usual story we hear is a story of India doing fantastically well. GDP growth rates, as you can see, has been going up steadily, especially from the early 2000s. Pretty much from 1991, it started because the reforms were the big, the kick-started the growth process. And then from that on, we have been seeing very high rates of growth. Of course, there are years where growth rates dip. Demonetization was one such episode. COVID was another such episode. But even then, growth came back quite quickly in India, as we saw from the post-COVID years. And if you look at India compared to the rest of the world, India is the blue line here, the light blue line here on the right-hand side of the graph. And you can see India is outperforming most other economies. The only one probably not outperform is China. I have China here inside the East Asian Pacific bundle, but China's growth rate's also been very, very strong, at least till quite recently, but not the last couple of years, I would say. Okay, so that's the story we hear about India. The economist calls India the one bright spark in the world economy. Again, these are projections for 2023. You can see 6.1 is a projection for last year, which more or less it was a little bit around that. I think a little bit higher than that, and India is again outperforming in the more recent years in terms of compared to other economies. So that's the story we hear, and of course it's true. I mean, India has been doing very well in terms of economic growth, right? But the other part of what I want to say is that while growth is of course important, but we have to keep in mind, and the way we think about it as economists is we have this model in our mind that we keep on going back to. And the model that we have in our mind is the model that more or less comes from Arthur Lewis, but there are others like Simon Kuznets also have set out this model. And this model that we have in our mind, and this is kind of almost universally accepted among economists, I think, one of the very few things which I think is universally accepted, is the fact that we have this structural transformation process where workers are mostly in agriculture at the beginning of the development process. And then over time, they start leaving agriculture for manufacturing and services, manufacturing first, and then later on services. That's the story we know has happened in all the rich countries that we have in the Western world, has happened in East Asia, has happened in Latin America. And of course, is India going to go into the same pattern or not? That's the question. The only countries which are not in this group where we haven't seen this kind of structural transformation are resource-rich economies like obviously UAE. And in countries that in the Middle East, but those are the exceptions. So what I want to do is now I'm going to show you first overall patterns, structural transformation, of which I've been working on for quite some time. And I'm going to talk a little bit about this book which came out earlier this year, which is a book that puts together some of the standardized facts of structural transformation using a comparable data set which we did in UNU Wider, which was probably the first time we have now sectoral employment and output data for a lot of low-income countries. So that's why this data set is pretty important. And I'm going to sort of take you through a little of the stylized facts from the book itself, and then I'm going to get into India. Because I don't want to get into India without an India story, without giving you the overall story, because you need to see where is India in the story, right? So again, just to go back to this particular point, that structural transformation and economic growth go hand in hand. You should go hand in hand. Or certainly sustained economic growth, growth that goes over several decades. And that's exactly what we have seen in the richer countries and in East Asia. And this is the emblematic vision of economic development. Structural transformation, workers moving out of agriculture to manufacturing and services. And it's as I say, unifying vision of economic development, not only among academics, but also among policymakers. You talk to any policymakers in Africa, because we do a lot of work in Africa in UNIWIDER, they will always say to us, like, okay, how do we get structural transformation going in our country? Because in Africa, of course, that's been a big problem. So this book is open access, and you can download it. It's a very short book. It's written for a particular series we started in UNIWIDER called the Cambridge Elements series in development economics. So this book is around 30,000 words. So it's not a very large book, not a very big book. So just to talk about the data, because my story is going to come from the data that I'm going to use, and you need to know exactly what the data is, okay? So the data that we use is a data set that when I came to UniWider, one of the things because I was always interested in this question, but I felt like we didn't have the data, and how do we answer this kind of questions? And if you look at the data sets that we have in the World Bank and the ILO, they are hugely problematic. So we had to then think about how to compile this data set, and of course, the group that is excellent in this kind of work is the Groningen Growth and Development Center founded by Angus Madison, the historian, and that's where the data on input-output tables, Penn World tables, you name it, all come from this place, right? So I went, and they had already got an existing data set with a 10-sector database, which had a lot of the high-income countries where we have sectoral output and production data. So there, what happened then was that we worked with them, and they did most of the work in all fairness, where we put together a time series of employment and real GDP. Oh, by the way, I suddenly remember Abdul is in Groningen, so he knows very well about this group. So we put together about the data and employment real and nominal value added for 12 sectors, and I'll show you the sectors in a minute, in 51 countries, of which a whole chunk of countries are low-income countries. And that's what I said, that we didn't really have that before. 1990, because this data set needs very careful archival work on census, labor force surveys. We did not have reliable data before 1990 to do this for low-income countries. And we saw it in 2018, because after that, we didn't have more recent census data also. Okay, includes 20 Asian countries, 9 Latin American, Asian, of course, because India, 4 Middle Eastern and North African countries, and 18 Sub-Saharan African countries in different levels of economic development. It's constructed from an in-depth investigation of the algorithm usability of statistical sources on a country-by-country basis. It took a long time to put this data set together. So not a updated data set. It's a new data set. The numbers there are numbers that are really freshly compiled for this particular data set. And as I said, the best coverage of low-income countries that we have among all data sets. We use the ISID revision full classification. And so, yeah. So there's sectors. The sector that we have, most of them you can recognize: agriculture, mining, manufacturing, utilities, construction, trade services, transport services, business services, financial services, real estate, government services, and other services. In the 10-sector database, by its definition, didn't have a couple of sectors which you have here. And one thing I've been arguing in the book is that when you go services, you've got to be careful because services is very heterogeneous. And there are two kinds of services. One are business services, which is business and financial services. So IT is an example, finance. The other are non-business services, which are trade, transport, government, of course, public sector, and other services. Trade being a lot of restaurants and so on are in that group. Right? And they're very different from each other. In fact, business services to a large approximation is tradable. Not everything, but quite tradable. While non-business services to a large extent is non-tradable. So you could even use tradable, non-tradable as a way to think about the services. Okay. So what I did in this book, and I want to speak this first about India in this kind of typology. I did a typological approach to social transformation. I did that because among the people that I find the most important for my own thinking, exactly as I said, are people like Kuznets and Lewis, but also the work that was done by others who were trying to use a way to think of economic development in the 1950s by using a typological approach. What is a typological approach? So what you do is you classify countries by certain characteristics, criteria. In that time, they were looking at import substituting countries, export-oriented countries. So at that time, what the debates were about import substitution versus export orientation. This is Chenery and Chenery's work. Alice Chenery's work is very important here, and Moses Silkin. Obviously, that kind of classification is not relevant in the current context, because every country has gone through input liberalization, and we don't really have countries in the classical sense that India was in the 1950s, right? So what I use is a much more intuitive classification, where I put countries in three groups: structurally underdeveloped, structurally developing, and structurally developed. So structurally underdeveloped is the countries which are agriculture still the largest sector in terms of employment. So that's the structurally underdeveloped category. And in this set of countries, you can see which countries are there. And interestingly, India's there. So the last year that we have data for, 2018, do we have more workers in agriculture than any other sector? So basically 51% of plus, okay? India's in that group. And if you look at the countries there, what you find interesting in this set of countries is that India is in the same group with many low-income sub-Saharan African countries. There are a few from Asia also. We have Vietnam, we have Bangladesh, Cambodia, but pretty much the rest of these countries are all in sub-Saharan Africa, okay? Just to keep that in mind. The second category is where we have more workers in services than agriculture. So there's enough movement out of agriculture now, okay? But agriculture is the second largest sector. And in these countries, you have mostly East Asian countries here. We have quite a few Latin American countries. Notice in the earlier group, there was not a single Latin American country, okay? Now we have a lot of Latin American countries, and now we have a classification. This group spans 3 continents. And the final category that we have are structurally developed, which is the countries where there are more workers in manufacturing than in agriculture. And in this group, again, these are mostly Latin American, and also now we start seeing the so-called tigers, South Korea, Singapore, and Taiwan, okay, and a couple of Middle Eastern countries too. So this is a useful way to start thinking about locating India within the broader story of such transformation. And as I said, the thing what I want to tell you here is that even in this classification, India is, if you look at the other countries in this group, almost all have lower per capita income than India. In this group, India actually, per capita income is among the highest, if not the highest. Vietnam might be also very similar, but India is among the highest. So right away, it's very strange. I mean, what's happening here? Okay, but that's just one part of the story. So, as I said, in the third category, there is no African country except Mauritius, which many people will say is not an African country. Okay, so the third category, structurally developed, there is no African country except Mauritius. Okay, now I want to tell a story. Now I'm going to go to India, and I'm going to try to tell a story about how India is doing versus the rest of the developing world. Okay, so the first thing I was going to do is to just look at overall sectors. Okay, I hope you can see that. Yeah, overall sectors: agriculture, manufacturing, non-manufacturing, and services. So I'm not disaggregating here. Okay, non-manufacturing is construction, utilities, and mining. Okay, and services we already saw. So if you go back to the classification here, that I showed you earlier, just to be clear about what they are. Services is essentially starting from trade onwards in the list here. So number 6 onwards is services. Okay, and non-manufacturing is 2, 4, and 5. Manufacturing is number 3 and agriculture number 1. Okay, so using this classification. So what do we get then? If you look at this, is that you see that agriculture employment is falling very slowly. It's falling, of course, but it's falling very slowly. Okay, so over time, it's still India's got agriculture, as I said, because of its large chunk of workers in agriculture. Still over 40% of workers are in agriculture. The yellow line is the service line. Services bar is services, and you can see slowly it's a slow increase in services. And then we find this gray line, non-manufacturing industry. Now we think it's a bit strange. Why is that sector having so many workers? It's mining. I mean, how many workers does mining employ? It's utilities. How many workers are employed by power plants and so on? Well, construction, is that a labor-intensive sector? So right away, we think there's something wrong here because that particular sector should not be providing so much work, so much employment. And then we have manufacturing, which, as you can see over this period, this 30-year period, there's been hardly any change. From 1990 to 2018, there's been hardly any change in terms of share of employment. Right? So you start getting into a little bit like, this is really strange. What's going on here, right? And now I disaggregate the data. And when I disaggregate the data, I find exactly non-manufacturing industry, not really labor intensive, but yes, one part of that is extremely labor intensive and is providing the most amount of employment outside agriculture, and that's construction. If you look at construction in 1990, and you look at construction in 2018, 1990, it was like a few percentage points of total employment share. In 2018, it's now well over 10%. And look at manufacturing, far less. Look at even service, the different services. Business services, IT, supposed to be a growth sector in India, doesn't really employ too many people, right? So this, again, makes you think, and this is where I started thinking about this problem, that this is a bit strange, right? That construction is giving more employment than manufacturing, than services, disaggregated services. So what's going on here, right? And then I think, I don't know if you can see, it's getting cut off actually, and so unfortunately, sorry. So the next one is when I only look at structurally underdeveloped countries. Because you might say, okay, maybe India's not doing too badly compared to the category that India is in. And when I look at such underdeveloped countries, this is only for such underdeveloped countries, actually there also construction is not so important. So the blue line there hasn't really changed. There's been a bit of an increase, but nowhere near what we saw in India previously, right? So there, yes, agriculture also, employment share is falling very slowly. These are countries which haven't seen such a transformation, but there the big growth has been in services, service sector employment. Manufacturing also not much. So even within the group that India is in, structurally underdeveloped countries, India seems to be an outlier. So I want to now examine this particular proposition more systematically. I'm going to try and do that, comparing India across other countries more systematically, okay? And then again, this is for all developed countries, all developing countries. There in this all developing countries includes, of course, South Korea and Taiwan and so on. Construction is hardly important. So India's an outlier not only for among all developing countries, India's an outlier even for the group that it is in. Okay, so let's look at this more systematically. Is India really an outlier? Okay, so let's start now. Let's do this in this way. We will take different sectors, okay, and I'm going to compare these sectors over these 2 periods that I have, and I'm going to do it by controlling log GDP, because you could say, well, log maybe countries that are richer have more workers in construction, because construction, people are buying houses, all this sort of thing. So you need to control for GDP per capita. So I do that, okay? Now look at agriculture employment in India. India, as I said, has a big chunk of workers in agricultural sector. And over time, there's been a shift, but not much. But as far as this particular agricultural employment share is concerned, India is not an outlier for controlling for level of economic development. Okay, So you can see that so I put a red line around India. India is not an outlier. It's on the regression line. Okay, so that part, okay, no problem. Then we look at manufacturing. Again, India actually was doing better in 1990 than it is doing now. So again, controlling for log GDP and look at the regression line, India was higher than predicted by log GDP per capita. In 2018, or last few years of the 2000s, we don't really see India doing all that much better. There are many other countries now that are doing so much better. I mean, China, of course, is there. Taiwan is there. Taiwan is spectacularly doing well in manufacturing. So is China. But there's a whole bunch of other countries there, including Sri Lanka, LKA is Sri Lanka. So Sri Lanka among the South Asian countries also doing very well. Okay. So India is not is not an outlier in manufacturing. If anything, it is underperforming manufacturing. Services, now which of course includes business services, which is IT, right? So mostly IT in India. So there again, India is actually an outlier in a different direction. India's service employment share is lower than what is predicted by log GDP per capita. In the 1990s, there was there a little bit, but 2018, even more so. So controlling for log GDP per capita, India's service employment share is below the regression line. Okay. So then if all of this is true, the agriculture, it's not an outlier. Manufacturing is not really an outlier. Services outlier in a different direction. Where is the employment share? Where are the workers going? And then I look at construction. And what do I find? I find construction in the 1990s, India was not an outlier. In 2018, look at where India's employment share in construction is. I mean, if you see the other countries below that, there are a few others, but nowhere near India's construction employment share. So this is definitely telling us that India is an outlier in this particular dimension, that its workers, when they do more of agriculture, very slowly, they almost all seem to land up in construction. So that's really quite remarkable. Now you might say, well, so what's the problem? Okay, so India's, other countries had workers moving to manufacturing. In Sub-Saharan Africa, you see moving to services. What's the big deal here? Why is it a problem when India's workers are mostly ending up in construction? Well, there is a problem because the story that we were telling was transformation. The story that the Lewisian story is that you move from low productivity sectors, agriculture, to high productivity sectors, which is why you have economic growth. So the reallocation of workers and capital happening in the economy as workers are moving away from low productivity to high productivity sectors is the reason why you have economic growth. So that story is a story of movement of workers from low productivity activities to high productivity activities. Manufacturing and service are high productivity activities. Covered agriculture, that is why social transformation and economic growth go hand in hand. So therefore, in India, what we see is a story where workers are moving from agriculture, a low productivity sector, to construction. Then the story has to be that construction is a high productivity sector to be fitting with our model that we have in our mind, the Lewisian model, or any kind of process of transformation we've seen anywhere else, right? So now the question then is, which I now need to answer is construction a high productivity sector or not? Okay, so before I get to that, let me show you another graph, okay? Because I really want to get this point very clearly across. So in this graph, what I have is employment share, where you have the different categories, structurally developed, structurally underdeveloped, and developing. And if you look at the lines of construction employment share, pretty much they are increasing very, very slowly. There's one line you can see in the red line, which is India, where you can see the takeoff happening in construction employment share. It's pretty much happening from 2000s. Okay, before that it was kind of moving along with generally the other lines, and then the 2000s you can see this big move up. Okay, and of course as you go forward in time, I don't have more recent data than 2018 because the data set ends in 2018. I'm pretty sure that's what it was going to see. Okay, that even more of an increase in construction. Okay, so that's quite clearly now that part of the stylus factor is very, very clear. Okay, now what about productivity? So first, what I do same thing as I did before. I just look at the productivity for the basic broad sectors: agriculture, manufacturing, non-manufacturing, industry, and services. And there I get the story that basically agriculture is not very productive. manufacturing is the blue line. That's it's also it's more productive, and so on. But there's one black line there, right there, which is actually less productive than agriculture. It's a bit strange, and that's non-manufacturing industry. So, and yet non-manufacturing industry has mining, has utilities, which are very productive. So therefore, again, construction must be that sector that's driving productivity down in non-manufacturing industry. And that's exactly what you find. So here, you look at this different bars over time. So this is real level growth. Again, sorry, not here. This is real level growth. So productivity. So how do I get this? I have value added in capacity from the data set. So look at agriculture. Very unproductive and increase, agriculture. Manufacturing is steady increase, capital intensity increasing, etc. Reforms happening, the agriculture is increasing. Mining actually is, this is not all that productive, but still, utilities is very productive, but that's just, think of a power plant and so on. So you need to speak on the mic. Okay. All right, let's, yeah. Then maybe I should repeat myself. So what I'm trying to, in this graph, what I'm doing is I'm looking real labor productivity, and that's real value added over employment. And I'm looking at different sectors by disaggregated categories. So I'm saying that agriculture has been very little increase in real labor productivity. Manufacturing there has been, and that's because of capital intensity increasing and potentially also total productivity also increasing. Though that is not so obvious because the data is not clear on that. And so manufacturing, mining, utilities are obviously over time, productivity is increasing quite sharply. But look at construction. First, if anything, a decline, number one. Second, look at where it is with agriculture. So construction is almost, if in fact, equally unproductive as agriculture. And then the other groups are trade, which is also not a very, but still has been increasing in productivity, transport, business IT also, and finance, and so on. Even the government sector, which is seen as historically a very unproductive sector, is more productive than construction. So what we have is a story where it's like a real puzzle, right? Because the real puzzle is that we are talking about a situation where we have workers moving out of agriculture to construction mostly, and all that's happening is they're trading one unproductive job for another unproductive job. That's not structural transformation. So this is really puzzling. Yet in this period, we have seen high economic growth. So growth has happened, but obviously the growth that we've seen is not the kind that we normally think about, which is movements into more productive activities, right? So this is a real puzzle. Now, I'm not going to answer this puzzle completely in this, because this is something I'm still thinking about, and I want to hear your views on what that might be. But I want to just go back again to that model that I mentioned, Lewisian model, right? The Lewisian model, as I said, is a model that we have, which is perhaps the most powerful model we have for economic development, where this movement was for what Lewis calls the traditional sectors. Lewis did not really use the word agriculture, and I'm just using this because that's how we think about sectors. But he used traditional sectors and modern sectors. So his story was about workers moving from traditional sectors to modern sectors, okay? Now, right away, you can assume that traditional is agriculture, largely, not completely, and modern is manufacturing and modern services or business services, right? And in this model that Lewis had, and that's why even if you think of the Harris-Turalo type models, they're also interlinked. Along with this movement was migration going on. So workers moved from rural areas to urban areas. Classic example, the most recent example is China, right? In China, we've seen huge amounts of movements of workers from villages to cities, along with manufacturing employment increasing remarkably, right? So this story we have from Lewis or from the Harris-Turalo kind of dual economy models or any other model that we think about is not what we see in India. And in fact, there's a particular question. So this right away tells you, sorry, I'll talk about the Lewisian quotation in a minute. So right away, it sort of makes you think that what's really happening here is that we do see migration. Slowly, India doesn't have huge migration rates, but this migration is basically workers who are ending up in construction as a residual sector because they can't, the agriculture is no longer is not very productive and need to find other jobs. So the stream of workers coming from agriculture to rural to urban areas are essentially ending up in construction, which is the sector just simply absorbing these workers without any productivity gains, right? And actually, this particular phenomena has been discussed for India, has been discussed by not an economist, but by an anthropologist named somebody called Jan Bremen. Bremen has been talking about this for a long time. Of course, no economist pays attention to anthropology. That's a different problem. But but I'm a big fan of Bremen's work, and in that he talks about how exactly, because he does a lot of field work, spends time with construction workers at construction sites. He talks about what he calls footloose labor, right? So these workers that are in construction sites in India all over the country are workers who are today here in Bombay, in Delhi. Tomorrow they might be in Jaipur. Because whenever the work comes there, most of them have now mobile phones, and the work, and somebody's saying, look, you have to go to the city and there's some work going on there. So they pack up their bags, they don't have their families with them in most cases, the family's still in the villages, and they just move somewhere else, right? These are temporary contracts, these are often not proper contracts, they are getting paid on a daily basis, and so they do not know today I've got some work, tomorrow what might happen. The work is very, very short term, and that's what he calls what we have in India, footloose labor. And that's exactly what's going on, right? These workers that we're talking about, the construction sector, is essentially to think about exactly the picture I'm showing on the right-hand side. That's what we see in India. So that's an interesting point that in anthropology, anthropology working on this has picked up this phenomena much more clearly and documented much more clearly than what one sees in economics. And that's an interesting observation. Okay, so Lewis. So Lewis, Lewis has this, the 1954 paper. We are celebrating the 70th anniversary this year on Lewis, and I know there are already a couple of conferences that are going to look at the Lewis paper again this year in Manchester, actually, because his paper came out in Manchester School, the journal Manchester School. So Lewis says the following thing, which I think is so accurate. So what he says that we have a situation when one island of expanding subsistence employment surrounded by a sea of subsistence and a number of such tiny islands. So some are heavily capitalized modern industry, modern sector, mining, electric power, he mentions that. And when we have these primitive techniques in the traditional sector, right? So we have few high-class shops surrounded with massive old-style traders, a few capitalized plantations surrounded by a sea of peasants. If I had to revisit this paper, I would put in one more phrase, construction in the sea of subsistence. So Lewis, at that time, construction still wasn't important, but that's what we're seeing in India. In the sea of subsistence that we see in India, there is construction. That, in fact, is the sea in India. So that's something that is interesting, that when I looked at this paper again, I thought, well, that's really interesting, because he had not thought about construction being an issue of movement, but certainly that's what we're seeing in India, right? That we're seeing a sea of subsistence where workers are moving from one substance sector, agriculture, to another substance sector. Okay, so now, so what's going on? And this is where I think, it would be good to have a discussion on. I'm going to try and finish quickly now. So two things are going on, and which are perhaps might explain part of the story or complete the whole story. So we have had very poor agricultural productivity growth. That is clear from this particular graph I showed you, but it's very well documented, right? We haven't had very strong productivity growth, especially the early years when we had the Green Revolution. Agricultural productivity growth increased quite sharply, and I have a paper on that shows that had a big effect on poverty. But after that, there's been this plateauing of agricultural productivity, okay? So, of course, then there has been not much work created in agriculture. And then you have to get out of agriculture at some point, right? So that's the one supply side story. People were driven out of agriculture, and that's not surprising. On the other hand, the problem is, where exactly will the workers go? There is very limited demand for manufacturing and business services. Typically, what would happen is they would move into the more productive manufacturing or business service sector. But that's not happening because manufacturing demand the demand for workers in manufacturing is extremely low, right? Because manufacturing is not done well in India. So then we have a situation, and then that's one part of the story, the demand side story. The other thing that might explain this, and this needs more systematic research, is that we may have construction work going on in villages which are to do with the PMGSY program, which is about rural roads being constructed. So even though I haven't looked at it yet as carefully as I need to, I do think some of the story of construction employment is coming from this particular government scheme, the PMGSY, and this needs to be examined more systematically. Third, and maybe in Manrega also, the Manrega is a sort of construction that happens in Manrega. Third, the property boom. We were discussing, Anant and I were discussing the situation in Delhi and how the property prices increased sharply here. There's been several booms in property prices, and so we have this increasing voracious demand of the middle class to buy property. The part of the story might well also be to do with the property boom and a lot of financial speculation around the property boom, right? So I'm not going to say there's one explanation for what we see in India. I do think the supply side factors are important. That is low productivity growth in agriculture. But I also think that on the demand side, there are different factors that are playing that are also important. And exactly to what extent they are important needs more systematic economic analysis, which I haven't done as yet. Okay, so manufacturing, I mean, this story is so obvious, I'm not going to try to get through it. Manufacturing, India is really performed very poorly in manufacturing. That was also obvious on the graph I showed to you on manufacturing employment, which is even after the reform started. So manufacturing, and again, there are lots of reasons behind why. I don't want to get into the specific reasons. I do think that employment protection legislation is one part of the story. Labor laws in India, again, well documented. Infrastructure, of course, is a big part of the story. The trade regime is still biased towards more capital-intensive activities. So all those things are also important. But that's, again, a question of why has not manufacturing been the sector absorbing workers from agriculture, from agriculture. Okay. So I have just just talk very, very quickly. So in a separate paper, it's a more technical paper, unlike this presentation, it's not technical at all. I actually estimate construction productivity and its effects on income convergence. So there's a cross-country analysis. And what I do in that paper is to show that if I change construction productivity by X amount, how much income disparities go down across countries. Okay, but because I have a model there and I have a way of calibrating the model, I can actually then say, okay, if India's construction productivity increased by X amount, what will happen to India's per capita income? And when I do that, and I close the productivity gap in India's construction and other countries, I find that the difference between India's GDP per capita and the top income decile in this group of developing countries drops from 16.2-fold to 7.1-fold by half. So one part of the story is also that apart from the fact that construction is providing a lot of employment, it is also a construction is a very low productivity sector. And if you could fix that problem, if you think that there's no other way to solve the problem in India for employment, you could fix that problem, India's per capita income will increase sharply. That's just a counterfactual calibration. So I'm not trying to sort of say that's exactly what we'll see, but it's interesting that seems to be driving one part of the story, okay? All right, let me now sort of stop here. So what are the future? Right now, the question of jobs and joblessness is a major policy issue. We saw that in the discussion that happened in the last few months before the election and so on, and that's a huge issue. But I think bigger than that issue, perhaps, or linked to that issue, is the problem that we're seeing that structural transformation in India has followed a very, very strange path. Not what we have seen for other developing countries or countries which became rich without rich. Very, very different path. So even among the group I call structurally underdeveloped group of countries, India is an outlier. So what we seem to see is a Lewisian trap. I think it's a trap in a way where we see workers moving from low productivity agriculture to low productivity construction. It's a Lewisian trap, okay? And how do we fix this? One way to fix it has to be fixing productivity, low productivity construction. What does that involve? Well, that involves, in a way, some displacement of workers in construction, because you got to modern construction in most developed countries is with machines. So there is a part of the problem that if you do want to fix the productivity problem, you may have to bring in machines for construction, which may displace more workers. And then again, the problem is, where do they go? And of course, obviously, and that's something that we have talked about for many, many years, we have to fix the manufacturing problem. Because unless you fix the manufacturing problem, people will always end up in construction when they leave agriculture. And of course, business services, but business services historically doesn't tend to employ a lot of workers. I'll stop here.
Oh, thanks, Kunal. This is a lovely presentation. Let me, trying to stay with our timelines. I have 4 discussants, so let me first turn the floor over to them. I have Professor Amit Basole. Are you online?
Yes, I'm here. Am I audible?
Yeah, you are audible. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. And thank you for inviting me, Dr. Roy. And very good to hear the presentation, Dr. Sen. It was, I really enjoyed it. And in particular, I appreciate the sustained focus on construction, because this is something that, has been in the discourse for a while. What is going on in the sector, and the fact that it has been the one where the labor from agriculture has been moving. And I think we need to understand a lot more about what is happening. So I really appreciate this, including the paper that does the counterfactuals on construction productivity. So I'll make just a very few brief remarks around this only. The way we had thought about this problem a few years back was in terms of 2 distinct processes. What we are borrowing from Professor Ajit Ghosh, we call the Lewis and the Kuznets process. And just to differentiate the fact that the sectoral transition can be different from the employment structure issue, which is really what India is a very good case of, that you can have movement out of agriculture, but persistent informality and surplus labor in non-agricultural sectors. So in the Lewis sense, we are not experiencing a transformation, even if in a narrow sense of, reduction in agriculture, as Dr. Sen also showed, in a cross-country sense, India is not an outlier when it comes to the share of the workforce in agriculture. But if you look at it from an employment structure point of view, India is an outlier in terms of the share of workforce in informal employment. And that is because a lot of construction is actually informal employment, mostly casual labor, not so much self-employment. So that's the, it seems like the Indian case illustrates the importance of understanding structural transformation in terms of employment structure rather than sectoral structure, to put it simply. And when we look at it in terms of employment structure, the share of regular salaried workers, if I take that as the proxy, and I put casual labor and self-employed workers as one basket, then that's really the number to watch for. What is the aggregate share of regular salaried workers? And that did experience an increase in the high growth period to an extent, but not nearly as much as we would have liked. And instead, we see a sort of lot of self to casual movements happening. And in fact, even at the micro level, the PLFS data clearly shows big movements of workers from agri to construction and back seasonally. So we see a very clear seasonal pattern in people participating in both agriculture and in construction. And that's sort of the livelihood strategy, if you will, of the household. 1 foot in the construction economy, peri-urban, semi-urban, urban, whatever, and 1 foot in the agricultural economy. So that together constitutes that surplus labor sector. Now, I think some things to think about here a little bit more. On the supply side, so the labor supply to the construction sector, Dr. Sen has clearly laid out what is going on there. On the demand side, so where is the demand for construction labor coming from? And if we can broadly think of that as public sector infra-driven demand, so PM Gram Sadak Yojana would be an example of that. Manrega would be an example of that. Maybe a few other kinds of infrastructure type of projects, etc. So there's public sector infra, there is private residential, there's private non-residential. These are the broad kinds of things. I at least still don't understand. The public sector push seems clear, but in the private, I don't understand clearly where is this demand coming from. So we are used to thinking of India's development path as, unequal, a lot of growth accruing to the top, whatever top percent and so on. So is it really derived demand from that section of society that has benefited post reforms that is driving so much construction activity. There was a reference to real estate booms and things like that. Is that enough in a macro sense to explain all of this huge amount of labor that construction is apparently able to absorb? Do we need any other explanation for it? Because my impression is that one can see all the way down to the rural sector, residential construction taking off in the late 2000s, early, before the taper tantrum crisis and the decline of the construction sector a little bit in that period. Before that, the high growth period, you can see demand for construction coming from not just cities, but, all the way down to the rural areas. So who is, financing this? Where is this labor demand? How is it coming from? Where is it coming from? I think that's something we need to understand a little bit better. And finally, on the point of improving productivity in construction, of course, one has to agree with that. The flip side, of course, of that is that it is not going to be as labor absorbing anymore, because that's just mechanically true. Now, what are we, so what is the sort of path that we are imagining? Is this that working on making construction higher productivity and therefore releasing labor from it? So where does that labor go? Is the vision, other services, manufacturing? We're sort of back to that same question, I think, that, of course, has been debated for many years in India. So now, in a sense, it's not just the agri labor that we are talking about placing in manufacturing or services. It's agri plus construction viewed as one big surplus labor sector that we are talking about relocating. And that brings us back to constraints to job creation in manufacturing, etc., and the failure of manufacturing to perform. I'd like to hear some thoughts if Dr. Sen has further to what was said in the PowerPoint. I will just say one last thing. I'm sure many people here would have seen that recent paper in Structural Change Economic Dynamics by Dr. Goldar and colleagues on manufacturing. And I haven't had the time to really look at it closely, but the claim appears to be quite an interesting and surprising one, that the share of manufacturing and value added in India it seems to be underestimated as per the paper. And there's a big jump. I think, if I'm right, goes past 20% as opposed to 14 or whatever that we are used to thinking of as a stylized fact. And if that is the case, if actually manufacturing share in value added is that high, and employment share is, of course, nowhere close to being that high, then we're talking about some fairly high productivity manufacturing happening in India, which at least was not my prior. So I'm curious if Dr. Sen or indeed anybody else has anything to say about that paper and its implications. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Basule. Wait, let me now move to who is the next in the list. Okay, we have Dr. Abdul Aziz. Are you online?
Yes, I am online. Can you hear me?
Yeah. So,
Okay.
if you like to go ahead.
Thank you, TC Anand sir, and thank you for inviting me to this seminar. I really appreciate it. It's a very important topic for India. And first, I would like to reinforce the importance of GGDC, UNU Wider Economic Transformation Database, in examining the evolution of structural change in developing economies from a comparative perspective, as Sen has wonderfully presented it. And now coming to the issue, which Sen has very nicely presented to us, the question of structural transformation in India, which feature the transition of workers from agriculture to construction sector rather than to manufacturing or even heavily to high value added services. And I wanted to add another dimension to this problem, this issue. First of all, as Sen clearly pointed out, construction sector is a sector which feature low productivity. This is not something unique to India. There is a recent paper by Austin Goolsbee and Chad Syverson, who document how poorly construction sector is performing in terms of productivity, relative productivity in the United States. They also note that this is also the case with some of the OECD countries, and they go into some developed country perspective explanation to that. I will not go into that. But now for India, one important aspect which we often ignore in the discussion of structural change is that we are, by default assuming that the mobility of workers across sectors is free. in India, or it is easily possible. So this is a very wrong assumption, actually, because I think there is this literature which Nina Pavnik and others have been talking about in the context of trade, for example, right? I mean, moving up to in the trade value chain. So the point is that when workers lose their opportunity and their employment in agricultural sector, whether the Indian workers are able or equipped to move to other productive sectors or not. That is an important question, right? Because manufacturing is becoming highly skill intensive. The services which are highly productive and highly high wage providing service sector are also becoming highly skill intensive. So what is happening is that the construction sector is one of the few sectors which can absorb this large chunk of workers which are released from the agricultural sector without needing additional skills or even generic or specific skills. So they can be much more easily compared to other sectors. Of course, there are sectors like trade and other places where if you want to be, kind of entrepreneur, you need some investment. So I think construction is a sector where these workers can be much more easily absorbed. That part is actually less addressed in the literature. So how the skill component makes the mobility of these people restricted between sectors. Now the second thing is that about the construction sector productivity. According to India Clumps database, construction sector is one of the least capital intensive sectors in India, close to agricultural sector. So definitely there is a lack of mechanization in construction sector, which also may be because it is cheaper to employ these workers because there are a lot of abundant workers available in the market who can be used in the construction sector. So there is less incentive to mechanize the sector. Now, another important problem. So one important problem I highlight here is that the human capital problem, or the education, the quality and accessibility to education, and how far we can, at least in looking ahead in the long run, how far we can address that problem is an important issue to consider if we wanted to enhance structural change. Now, the another important factor, of course, there is a demand side factor. There is an increasing demand, as both Amit and Sen has already indicated. But now it's another important point about manufacturing sector. Of course, the informal sector is an important issue. The rigidities in the labor market, which restrict the ability or incentive for formal firms to employ more and more workers and move to more labor intensive production is very difficult, actually. So increasingly capital intensive or manufacturing is. But I think Amit indicated about this new paper by Goldar about manufacturing sector. I think it's about the real output share, real value added share versus nominal value added share, if I remember correctly. But I will not go into that detail. I don't remember that exactly. Now, what is also happening about service sector? What we have seen from Sen's presentation is that there is some marginal increase in public services and also some business services, but not substantially high. But this is, again, I think has to do a lot with the ability of workers to move there, and also the opportunities definitely on the demand side, because some of these services sector which are growing fast in terms of employment in India are high skill services. So again, these workers are not able to go there. Now, an important question is that, okay, we see this structural change that feature movement of workers from agriculture to construction sector. Is it really bad? Of course, it is not as good as we want it to be. But at the same time, in a 2019 paper, I, along with Dev Kusumdas and a few other colleagues, have looked into this issue also slightly. What we found is that the relative wage in construction sector is still 3 times higher than agricultural sector. So which basically means that it is still attractive for workers to move from agriculture sector to a construction sector, and it will reflect eventually, in kind of some sort of positive structural change, because the relative productivity is slightly higher. But the important point and the most worrying point here is that the relative wage and also the relative productivity in agriculture and construction sector are converging over time, and they're coming closer. So there is no more potential for improving structural change and benefiting from structural change by moving workers from agriculture to construction sector. So I will stop here. The most important point I wanted to highlight in this context is the inability of workers to move across sectors in contexts like in developing countries, including India. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Abdulaziz. This was very nice. I now have Dr. Sunandan Ghosh. Dr. Ghosh, are you?
Am I audible, sir?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yep.
The floor is yours.
Well, I thank all of you to invite. And I thank Professor Sen separately, especially because my interest in Indian economy started by hearing one of his lectures back in 2018 in the Labor Economics Conference, which was hosted in IGIDR. So I would like to highlight certain aspects regarding Professor Sen's presentation. First things first, when I was a student, we were taught a paper by Arthur Lewis himself, most probably his one and only paper, which dealt with trade. And there he mentioned, because it is treated as the fundamental paper on the ground for unequal exchange. And thanks to Professor Manoj Pant, who actually introduced me to that paper long back. So there he said that that paper was all about UK's, the Great Britain's trade with its colonies. And there, Professor Lewis, Dr. Arthur Lewis, he said that the tropics, the climate, has a strong role to play for the productivity of labor. So the temperate Britain has higher productivity because of climate, and the tropical Indian colonies have lower productivity. And he was obviously talking more or less about agriculture. So climate is one major parameter in determining productivity. And unfortunately, the tropics face that problem. And that is, I think, started documented from Lewis's work till Izaz Ghani's work I recently remember. Then finally, there was one more theoretical framework which we have introduced so far trade is concerned. And I will get back why I'm talking about trade here. That's by Akamatsu, Japanese economist, and his flying geese paradigm. So there he talked about how countries move from low productivity exports to high productivity exports. So basically labor rich manufacturing to capital rich manufacturing over time. So it's an attempt to address the value addition as a country gets developed through its structural transformations. Unfortunately, India never took off. It never took off. So if we look at the East Asian or Asian miracle, that's what's coined. Let's take Japan, Singapore, Hong Kong, South Korea, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, China itself. India's maximum average growth rate, GDP, GDP growth rate, was 8.3 during the phase 2003 and 10. That's the maximum. This is in comparison to, say, China, 9.9 average for almost 30 years from 1979 to 2013. Compared to almost another 30 years by Malaysia, 1961 to 1996, 7.7. Indonesia, 1968 to 1996, 7.5. And I'm not going to tell you all these numbers. We all know the major reason is we never had a boom in the manufacturing sector. So if we look at the share of manufacturing in India's GDP, it never climbed. So, say for example, 1950-51, it was just a little bit over 10%, and 2010-11, that's the last thing that I have in my hand right now. So it should be around less than 20%, in and around, hovering around 20%. On the contrary, as Professor Sen pointed out, agriculture's contribution to India's GDP started in the 50s around 52%, fell to around 16% in and around 2010, 11, 12, 13, during that time. But the employment kept on hovering around 60%. And that's the famous, I think, that problem that though only one person's work is done, around 10 are working on the same field. Disguised unemployment, which we have all been exposed to that theory when we are students. Finally, one more data that I have in front of me right now. Manufacturing's average growth rate, 7.53 between 2000 to 2013 around, where services 6.97 from 95, 96 onwards. On the contrary, agriculture 3.31 for the same period. Now, where are we heading? We are heading at a problem, as Professor Sen pointed out, employability in the manufacturing sector. We do not have that. Neither the Indian population is enough skilled to be absorbed in a real sense in high value-added services sector. The services sector in which majority of Indians work are like ATM security guards, and they are under the contractual of banking sector. Very low pay. Now, manufacturing, when it comes to manufacturing, 2019, after listening to Professor Sen's lecture, I and one of my colleagues in Kerala, Vinoj Ibrahim, we worked on a paper, and we found that 95 percentile of Indian registered manufacturing units are of small sizes. So they do not have an option of employing economies of scale. The maximum, the mode hovers the maximum mode. Maximum mode means when I'm talking about 2-digit industries. So the mode lies between 6 to 15. The 6 and 15 are the number of employees engaged in a firm. Additionally, the problem is, if we look at the data supplied by International Federation of Robotics, and a non-profit organization from Germany, and their old robotics database, India ranks 11th in the world. So far, installation of industrial robots are concerned. We do not talk about it. We hardly. The degree of automation in Indian manufacturing over the last one and a half decades is phenomenal. So the growth rate of industrial robots in India surpasses that of Canada, Singapore. So I will stop here by saying, so yes, construction, productivity in construction, I have absolutely no clue about that. I have never worked on that area. But yes, sir, agriculture, it is still employing almost 60%, adding only 16% of GDP. Its productivity has never increased, and it's declining. And so for India's trade with the external world is concerned, even with GI tags, India is losing out. Say Darjeeling tea is losing out against Chinese oolong or Sri Lankan tea, Indian tea. So never picked it up. Automation in Indian industries, again, a big challenge for manufacturing employment. And until and unless we can channelize our labor into successfully or skill our labor successfully either into the services sector or the manufacturing sector, this gap or this trap, as you so mentioned, the Lewisian trap, will remain so. Thank you. I'll stop here, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Ghosh. Our last panelist is Dr. Satyaki Roy.
Okay.
Roy.
Thank you, Professor Anand, and thanks, Professor Sen, for this very interesting, fascinating presentation focusing on a kind of a Lewisian trap where, in case of India, people are moving from low productivity agriculture to low productivity non-agriculture, particularly construction. But what I would, in the outset, I would say that this focus on construction and whether it continues, where India continues to be outlier or not, it is true till 2015-18, what you have shown, because the construction boom and the major employment growth in construction happened in 2005-6 to 2011-12. Then the growth tapered down. So whether it still continues to be an outlier or not, we need to check. The second is that regarding construction, if it is true that people are moving from agriculture to non-agriculture, and that is construction, I would say that this basically substantiates the view people were talking about, this push factor that you also mentioned in your presentation, that agricultural productivity is very low in case of India, growth of agricultural labor productivity. And if we compare with China, if you compare the 3 decades, from say 1991 to 2022-23, we did an exercise recently, which basically shows that in case of China, agricultural labor productivity during 3 decades grew by 6 times, while in case of India, it is 2.5 times, which basically indicates that people were not being absorbed in agriculture because labor productivity growth was low, and so they were pushed out of agriculture, and construction was one of the area where they are being absorbed. But I would try to mention one aspect as well, that in 2000, probably 9, I did a paper. The paper was titled Structural Transformation of Employment in India, How Lewisian It Is. So basically trying to answer the same question, that this is the Lewisian trap, where you are not moving from low productivity to high productivity. And there I found that not only in construction, there are several occupations in services where the labor productivity is much lower than agriculture at that time. So this will continue to happen even if the absorption is not taking place in construction, which I think is the recent trend. The other thing which I want to point out is that if we also see that this low productivity in agriculture and the transformation not happening the way it should, is also an important point if you compare with China and Korea, the structural change, the way it has happened. Because often we say that China did well in manufacturing, India did well in services in terms of share in gross value added. But if you see the share in gross value added, both in manufacturing and services, in case of China, it is higher than India. So it is not that a substitution happened between manufacturing and services. Actually, what has happened, that China and Korea grew much faster in manufacturing and services, and the contraction of the share of agriculture was much faster compared to India, which didn't happen in case of India. And that is related to, I would say, that the major question which you hinted always in your presentation, although the recent focus in construction, but the answer lies in the growth of manufacturing. And if you see the kind, because I wanted to do a study which basically looks into the demand side of why there is a higher share of services in India, in a country like India, which you mentioned that the per capita income is not so high, where you have a service-led growth. And there you can see that if you see the average consumption basket of an Indian, the share of durable commodities is only 4%. 7% is semi-durable commodities. And if you add up non-durable commodities and services, it accounts around 89%. And that is basically because many of the services have become non-discretionary expenditure like education, health, and other things. So people are spending on that. That is creating a demand for services even in a country like India. I'd also say that we should not also, of course, you said that India is not an outlier, but I would say that it should not undermine the point that there is a severe decline in the share of manufacturing, both in terms of employment, if you compare a longer period of 3 decades. And that why I'm mentioning this, that this is not very much specific. In that sense, it is not an outlier, that it is not very much specific about India. It is about many developing countries, including China, where the share of manufacturing was at peak around 30% in 2014. But it has slightly come down to 28% in 2022. So there is a decline. My point is then the reasons are not very much specific to countries. I would say that there we need to link with this decline of manufacturing value added and employment with a larger process of liberalization, where a kind of international division of labor is being imposed upon developing countries, and the stages which were required for the development in terms of the stages we talk about, even the Lewisian and Kuznets process, that had been subservient to this international division of labor. And I would say that that explains the decline of manufacturing in these countries where you are inserted into the global production international division of labor. You might be producing a particular thing, specialize on a particular activity, and sustain on the basis of that, because you need not have to confine to the domestic market. You can explore the global market. But this growth, which is not at where you have a growth, but it would not initiate a structural transformation because you are confined to that particular specialized activity. So it is not driven by the demand which is generated in the domestic market. I think that is a major point which needs to be taken into account. I'd also say that this is precisely the reason that when you are not getting enough demand from the domestic market, but you have to compete the global market in the domestic economy as well, then of course what is going to happen is the rising import intensity, which actually reduces the manufacturing value added, both in terms of value added and manufacturing share, both in value added and employment. What I would say that what Professor Amit has mentioned, I would not say that this growth of construction is entirely driven by the high-end demand of luxury real estate. As I said, that it may have tapered down after 2013-14, but I would say that it is, of course, a diversion that has happened. Broadly, if you see the financialization process in India, just if you see that the growth of income in corporate sector, average yearly growth of income is around 14% in terms of income of corporate sector. And if you just see income from financial services, in which they are engaged into, it is more than 19%. And we are currently involved in some study on labor-intensive industries, manufacturing industries, where we see that it is not about that we have large number of unskilled labor and all this. But the point is, even in labor-intensive industries, to compete in the global market, the kind of components and efficiencies that are required, we are nowhere there. 90% of the components even used in a lady's bag is imported in case of India, and all the exporters depend upon those kind of components. So the point which I am trying to finally say, that financialization is one of the processes which has hampered the growth of manufacturing. And of course, we need to understand this decline of manufacturing, both in terms of value added and employment, in the larger process where the control over the demand, as well as the planning that is strategizing that is required, depending upon the domestic market, is actually undermined in this whole process. And maybe now it is construction. As you said, that you can increase the productivity in construction, but one of the panelists also raised this question, then people should find another place. And in case of manufacturing, it is only possible because it is easier to convert an agricultural worker to a garment worker. But in case of services, in terms of return, the inequality is very high. And that is precisely the reason if the growth is dependent upon services growth, it will be reflected in high inequality, which also comes from this World Inequality Lab report, recent report, which says that India experiences unprecedented inequality since 1922. So the service-led growth has that kind of a problem. And so of course, I don't think that construction for a larger period of time could be an escape route. We need to think about manufacturing. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Dr. Roy. Should I open it to the floor also? Maybe I'll. There are lots of participants, both sitting here as well as on the online. If anybody has questions to Professor Sen, but keep it very tight so that we can give him some time to close. We're pretty much reaching 10 minutes to closure. Maybe I'll extend it a little more. We are supposed to wind up at 5, right? Oh, we have till 5:30. Then we have time. So but then it's fine. Sorry, my misunderstanding. So anybody from the floor amongst the speak into the mic, please, know that everybody can hear you, and introduce yourself also.
Good evening, sir. Thank you for this presentation. My name is Ajit Jha. I'm working here at ISID. Fortunately, I work in the sector, construction sector, so I have so much interest about this presentation. So the first, the query that we found after, because we had your presentation, because we are also part of the seminar committee. So if you see the RBI claims data of the same period, the share of construction like that you have shown in recent, like after 2011-12, the share of construction is around 14-15%, while the share of agriculture is 38%, 39%. But if you see the RBI claims data or PLFS data, the share of construction is remain 11-12%. It is not 15%. And also, if you see the trends of say how there's a movement. So if you see the like that, I tried to use this data, RBI claims data, and find that, of course, there is a movement from agriculture to construction. Workers are moving from agriculture to construction. But after 2011-12, like Satki sir was raising the point, and also there's a paper by Nagraj and Mahajan, that after 2011-12, if you see the trends is not like that. The workers are exactly like the construction is, the share of construction is not moving up. Like there is a flat trend. So why this is happening? Because I found that the workers are not moving from agriculture to exactly in construction after 2018. In 2020, 21-11, in fact, they're moving from in services, like low-level services, other than the construction. And also, if you see the productivity data, labor productivity data that I tried to find what is the labor productivity. So we find that the labor productivity, of course, labor productivity is low in construction compared to manufacturing and services, but it is still high than agriculture. And there is a gap. There is a significant gap between agriculture productivity and construction productivity. And I think that's for the reason that workers are moving from agriculture to...
Hello? Is this? Are you finished?
Yeah, it was just a minute.
Yeah.
So I think if you just draw the line, you will find that the agriculture construction productivity is higher than agriculture productivity, and of course it has declined since 1980s, and there is a secular decline in the productivity, but it is higher than agriculture. And one more thing that, like Amit Basole was raising the point, like like in this paper also, that we are saying that construction is an easy entry point for the workers coming from agriculture. But if you disaggregate the data of construction between male and females, so only male workers are being employed in the construction. So female workers are not very in the same ratio is being employed. So of course, construction is an easy entry point for the workers who are coming from agriculture. But there again, there is a restriction also in terms of gender in it.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Can't hear.
Yes. So we have this flagship program, production-linked incentives. So if we want people to move from agriculture, the way people have moved from agriculture to construction sector, and which we consider relatively high productivity as compared to agriculture. But we also need to identify the next sectors that where the people move from constructions to the next set of sectors. So our focus is more on promoting capital intensive industries, that if you look at the PLI schemes and the 14th sector that which has been identified. In the last week, there is also news that we are also going to focus on container manufacturing, so that it is not aligned with the factor endowments that which we have, that we are moving far away from our factor endowments, that is primarily the labor intensive manufacturing. So where do you see that if the people have to move at some point of time, maybe let's take an example 10 years down the line from constructions to other industry, in which sector they are going to go? That if our focus is more on capital intensive, that which is not going to absorb the people.
Yeah, thank you, sir. I'm Isha. I would just like to know your thoughts on policy based on your analysis. Thank you.
Sir, I am Sinaya from here. ISID.
All right, go ahead.
Sir, that your book title says that varieties of structural transformation. Varieties, what is that varieties? It's because you put so many countries there, in different countries happening different type of structural transformation, or if you take any country also different type of structural transformations are happening. Structural transformation, we understand people moving from low value added to high value added, be it any sector. That way you understand. It can be also from high to low, but why you put it as a title? Just for my curiosity, I'm asking. This is the one.
Okay, thanks. All right. We have this sort of.
Sir, thank you, sir, for your presentation. I'm Rajesh. I'm from ISID. Just want your view on the structural transformation within manufacturing, because within manufacturing there is thought of like workers reallocate from low productive manufacturing sector to high productive. So what is your view on this? Rather than agriculture to construction, and within the manufacturing, what is happening? Thank you.
All right, I'm going to give you back the floor, Kunal, but before I do that, let me flag my point, not necessarily expect you to answer it. You know, I had done a paper recently in a conference which Delhi School organized on productivity, and I pointed out that low productivity in construction is probably a statistical artifact. It's an artifact arising out of how value added in construction is measured, at least, and I'm focusing exclusively on India. I have not done a cross-country thing, so I don't know whether this is an artifact which will happen maybe in other countries as well. Probably not in the developed countries because they rely more on accounting data for getting data from establishments in the construction sector itself. In India, construction is primarily value-added in construction is essentially done through a Leontief model. There is physical inputs which are taken, cement, bricks, steel, and so on. And ratios are applied, fixed ratios are applied to them. Those ratios have remained more or less constant over the years to get value added. Now, think about it. You have essentially got a constant returns to scale Leontief production function estimating value. And in this production function, there is no scope for productivity growth, virtually no scope for productivity growth. And in effect, that is what has happened with construction productivity. Construction is a complicated sector. There are, I will break it up into three types of construction or two types of construction. One is residential, which is a large chunk. There is no doubt that has happened both in urban and rural, both through public schemes and private activity. There is of commercial construction, which is structures, buildings, office buildings, and so on, which has also been a huge, and you can see the effect in virtually every urban area. And then there is infrastructure construction, which has been massive. PMGSY, highways, any number of public infrastructure. Now, the latter has a problem. A lot of it is in price control regimes. In fact, value added in these is very hard to measure because highway constructions, if they were properly commercialized with tolls and so on and so forth, you may actually get a fairly high return. But in India, very often these are, particularly PMGSY roads, are open access, free to use. So think about what it is doing to productivity measurement in the construction sector. You're underestimating productivity. The value gain is taking place in other places because PMGSY road means rural farmers are getting better returns for their product. They're shifting crops to more commercial crops. Rural markets are becoming deeper. And a lot of value added is taking place elsewhere. So construction may not be the low productivity sector if we do it conceptually. It's a statistical artifact because we don't have anything else to do it to measure it. This puzzle about, and I have other puzzles like this in productivity measurements, partly because we misread national accounts a lot when we use them for value-added measurements. I'll stop with that, hand you the floor.
That's really interesting. Maybe I'll start with that and part of the data issue came up because, so I don't know whether I heard that correct, because if what I showed you, the employment share in construction increases in the 2000s. It kind of starts in 2001, 2002 to 2018. Now, what happened after 2018, I don't know, because ET does not have the more recent data. For that, I have to look at PLFS, I suppose, right? But certainly in the ETD, and I totally trust the ETD. In fact, already Abdul also gave a good plug for the ETD because his group, where he is collaborated with us. I trust the ETD data on that. I think that, so I'm a bit surprised to hear the claims are showing different. The claims also grounding gain also contributes. So I need to check because certainly for the ETD, we're seeing big increase in construction employment share from 2000 onwards till 2018. Beyond that, we have to check. Sorry? Yeah.
Again, there is a rise in capital expenditure, which is recently I think the past few years, about 30%. But I don't think this is a particular kind of.
That's an interesting question. I mean, that's obviously an empirical question. But for that, as I said, the problem is if we go outside ETD, I start not really trusting the data, right? Now I can use PLFS, which is still okay. Maybe PLFS can give the answer. So I haven't looked at PLFS's last rounds, so I can check that. But what I'm trying to say that using the ETD, we're seeing till that point, as you said, the last, actually, I mean, even 2015, 2016, if we saw the time series plot I showed you, it's only the last couple of years that it flattens out. Okay, so open question, right? We can debate as long as you want, but we don't have the data. So, but certainly it had happened from the 2000 onwards. Okay, the employment share increase. Now, on the value added, by the way, TC, I should tell you that you're saying that in developed countries there is no problem in measurement.
Clarify that. I have not looked at it.
Right.
I am assuming that the problem is less. But I'm not.
If I tell you right now, the big debate happening on productivity in the US is construction, because Abdul mentioned that also. Stevenson's work is exactly on that. So this measurement problem of construction value added is a problem across the board right now. So there's a lot of interest right now in construction productivity for that reason in the US, you know. So so I think that's important to keep in mind. Now, whether that problem of value added mismeasurement is particularly more so in India, open question, possibly you're right. Of course, my story is mostly about employment. So, you know, so I think, but I take your point that there may be a problem with value-added calculations in construction, but it is a common problem that we have, right? Now, so let's go back now to Amit's very good comments, which I kind of agree with. So Amit, actually, I don't know if you know this, but I have a separate paper. Okay, which is presented yesterday in IIT Delhi, actually, on employment structure. So employment structure from which I use not the ETD, I use the National Sample Survey and the PLFS, EUS, unemployment surveys and PLFS after 2011. And there the employment structure story kind of mirrors the story I'm telling with ETD. There the story is very much about the fact that there has been not much of an increase in wage employment shares overall. And of course, big chunk of workers are in informal employment and what I call lower tier informal employment, construction workers, et cetera, et cetera. So the employment structure story and the structural transformation story I tell today are mirroring each other. It's not surprising. You're looking at similar data sets anyway. So there is something going on also on the employment structure story, which kind of almost confirms the story I'm telling from the sectoral employment side. So I don't think they go against each other. And then, of course, the question about what's really explaining this employment share increase in construction is the open. That's what I said, that I cannot answer that question because for that, I need to go beyond ETD, because ETD does not give you rural urban construction, does not give you also, looking at public works programs. So for that, I would need to go to the PLFS and PLFS because NSS stops at 2011. So PLFS need to look at exactly that, whether it's to do with mostly rural roads and PMGSY, infra versus residential. And that's something that actually, if anybody is thinking about something on this, I think it's a very interesting question, really. That's what explains this increase. And I kind of agree with Amit that I think residential construction, I just mentioned this because potentially it could be an explanation. At least I think he's sort of saying that it could be an explanation. May not be the most important driver of construction employment share. So I think that's an interesting question that I can't answer from the current data sets I am using for this paper. Then on what Abdul says, it's interesting that Abdul said that Abdul is still online. So is that the fact there are these frictions, if you can, I don't think Abdul use the word frictions, but I'm using it to explain the fact that there may be certain kind of structural constraints, we wish, or barriers to entry, because you need skills to enter manufacturing and certain kind of services, right? So one counterfactual would be that, okay, everybody in India gets a huge dose of higher skills, let's say, more human capital, and that might solve the problem, right? Of what we're seeing with construction being the outlier. Potentially, yes. I'm not completely convinced. In fact, there's others who said that manufacturing is the main issue in India now, that even if you had more skilled workers, if there's no demand for them, how does it solve the problem? So I'm not completely convinced that solving the skill problem, skill all the workers up by 1 or 2 notches, is going to solve the problem that we're seeing India doing pretty badly in manufacturing, and where workers ending up in construction. So, you need to worry about the demand side story also, right? And I think that the story, I do think skills are important. There's no question about that, but it cannot be the solution to what we see in India, the job creation problem, right? The demand side problem is, and I think Sateki also mentioned that. So I think I just want to sort of highlight that we almost forget that the real problem in India has been that India never really had labor-intensive manufacturing growth. So if you look at the other countries in East Asia, India missed the bus. Has it missed it completely? Open question. Okay. Is it never going to be possible again in India? I'm not sure. That's a difficult question to answer. I think there is still a lot of potential on that. But the real problem is that there has been not enough demand for manufacturing jobs, a demand for the workers. The manufacturing sector never really grew, especially the formal manufacturing sector. I have a paper which is coming on Bulletin of Indonesian Economic Studies, which compares Indonesia and India using sort of similar employment surveys. And there I find that in Indonesia, there's been a massive increase in formal wage employment because Indonesia saw a successful period of labor-intensive manufacturing increase, right? So I think labor-intensive manufacturing not doing well in India is certainly one part of the story, right? Because if there's a counterfactual, suppose there was a massive increase in labor-intensive manufacturing in India from the 1990s, of course workers will end up, a lot of the workers who leave agriculture will go there. That's what happened in China, right? That's what happened in Indonesia. That's what happened in Thailand. That's what happened in Malaysia. So why would India be different in that case, right? So part of the story is that there hasn't been this big drive, a big success level into manufacturing, which has been a part of the problem why we haven't seen workers moving into manufacturing, ended up in construction. So I think that's a really important story. Now, there's a very good question about the future and all these different skills you're hearing, PLI, and then of course we had Make in India programs. Is that the solution? Can that be the solution? Now, PLI is a recent program. We don't know yet the empirical evidence of this. As you know, there's a lot of debate going on about whether PLI will deliver jobs, right? I'm not going to take a stand on that because I think it's still open empirical question. But there may be arguments to think that maybe PLI's delivery of jobs, good jobs, is maybe limited because exactly as you said, it's more capital intensive manufacturing. So I think that's going to be interesting to see whether or not, that whether the new schemes that are coming in the last few years is going to finally break this problem, manufacturing not providing jobs. I think, let me just see if I want to say, because I'm quite conscious of time now, but
there is one question I noticed in the online. Bipul had a question, so should I ask him to ask it?
Bipul, yeah, why not? Yeah.
Bipul, I noticed from the thing that you had a question and a suggestion. Do you want to raise it just now before I ask Kunal?
Thanks, TCA. As usual, excellent work, Kunal. Kunal, there is no second thought that we have to have measures to increase productivity in our construction sector. Of course, automation is happening. I guess over time, automation is going to pick up. But I'm not very sure that that is the answer to enhance productivity in this sector. Of course, I'm not against automation, not a Luddite. I think we need to, I'm sure that you must have in your paper, you must have several measures, proposals to enhance labor productivity in that sector. And due to time constraint, it may not be possible for you to present all of them. But at the same time, I think we need to think differently other than just automation to enhance productivity in the sector. And one possible, and there are examples of it, is to engage, say, physiologists to train our workers with the basics about their body, their postures, things like that. And I know that there are large Indian companies who have started doing this. I know that Tata Steel in their Jamshedpur factory, they have been doing it for the last few months. And they are already showing improvements in the productivity of their labor. So several such things can be thought about and advocated for to enhance the productivity of this sector. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Bipul.
Yeah, in fact, that's another very important point that was raised about this. I think Amit raised it and others also, Sunandan who's left. The question is, productivity in construction. I mean, okay, right now, what do we have? Right now, assuming we can believe the numbers, right now we have, exactly as I was saying, Bremen's work shows footloose labor. People working in very, very poorly paid jobs in construction work sites, manual labor, which is why they are mostly men, right? I mean, how we can, the kind of work they're doing, lifting things up around, it's a very much manual work, right? Now, if you now brought in, mechanization in that sector, of course, some of these workers will lose their jobs, in fact, maybe quite a bit because they are also unskilled, right? But at the same time, you cannot justify the way what we see in India. You cannot justify the fact that there are all these workers in the construction sites getting so poor wages, living in most precarious conditions, moving from city to city looking for work. You cannot justify that, right? I mean, if you're going to call India going to be a developed middle-income country, you cannot justify this. I think it's morally wrong. I mean, I think that way I feel like we have to think about working conditions for these workers, right? So we're not talking about a situation, diggers come in and everybody gets displaced. That's not going to happen anytime soon. But we got to find ways that their productivity increases so that they get better paid, because there's no other way to increase wages in that sector if you don't increase productivity. So I think there is this important question that, which I think, policymakers need to think about. And there's a question on policy. What can we do for these workers? because minimum wages also does not apply in many of these cases. And therefore, one has to think about some improvements for these workers in terms of working conditions, et cetera, where I don't think any other way can be except trying to find ways to increase productivity, right? So I think there is a moral issue here which we should not duck, we should not avoid, because that's not correct. So I think so that goes back to people's question that there has to be ways to think about that productivity in that sector. Even though we might believe the numbers are not completely right, we cannot just purely, I'm sorry to say it in this way, if you walk around construction sites and see the way workers are living, there's no question there is productivity in that sectors are very, very low. May not be as low as I showed, but they're very low, right? So I think, and that is this question about manufacturing, which came up several times, right? I think that's, and I don't think I want to spend more time discussing manufacturing, because that's an area where I know ISID does a lot of work also. But I think that has to be the answer. And I think I slightly disagree with you. I do think there is still potential in manufacturing. I mean, you talk to the domestic market, but over even global value chains, India has not done well in integrating the global value chains, right? The global production networks. Yeah. So, why can't it be more in the global production networks? So I think there's potential there. How much that will deliver in terms of jobs, difficult to say, but at least at the margin, it'll have some effect. Yeah. So let me stop here because we already definitely out of time.
Thanks, Kunal. Kunal, this has been a really very exciting thing, and we got a very nice, rich discussion also. I think it's also been very thought-provoking for people in many ways. Let me just close by one point. Construction sites have changed dramatically, not in terms of the manner in which workers live, because there's not been much improvement, but in terms of improvement of technology. Something which I liked, and I'll close with this observation. I had an observation. I had gone to China. We flew into Beijing in 2007, sometime 2006, 2007. And the impression, both Shanghai and Beijing, because the flight landed first in Shanghai, then we took another flight to Beijing. One impression I got when I was landing in Shanghai and Beijing was the skyline was dominated by construction cranes. Huge number of cranes all over. And I used to wonder, when will I see this in India? And the answer is obvious to all of you, because anybody who's flown from anywhere to Delhi, Bombay, Bangalore, Hyderabad, Chennai, the same image is now visible. Now, in terms of use of equipment in construction, you can go to see urban construction sites in India, highway construction. The degree of mechanization which has taken place it may not be showing up in the data. And that's where I said we need to worry about how data captures it. But construction is not the same as it was when I was going to college. The workers, yes, and Amit has a point that but that's not a story of structural change which you're talking about, which is looking at purely from workforce transformation. You're looking at sectoral shift in transformation, and that transformation is happening. Productivity-wise, gauging these is a complex question. So I think it's been exciting. Thank you all. It's really nice.